everybody, what's up? It's Red from hashtag The More You Know and Coffee and Conversation. I'm here with Underground Media tonight to talk to you about Anchor FM. If you have not heard about Anchor, it is the easiest way to make a podcast. Let me explain. Anchor is your one-stop shop for podcasts. First, Anchor is free. That's right, you heard me correctly. It is free. Anchor will provide you with the creation tools necessary to record and edit your podcast straight from your phone or your computer. Anchor will then distribute your podcast for you to Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many other platforms. Do you like to make money? Sure you do. We all do. Who doesn't? You can make money with your podcast with no minimum listenership required. That's right, no minimum listenership. How awesome is that? So do yourself a favor and go to www.anchor.fm or go to your app store and download the free Anchor.fm app and get started today.
Hi, and welcome to another episode of Beyond Barriers podcast with your hosts, Acacia, Dietz, and Schoep. Today, our guest is Alon Milwicki, who earned his doctorate from American University studying the origins and proliferation of white supremacy with a focus on theological justifications for neo-Nazism in America. He is currently a research fellow at the American Terrorism and Resilience Institute and a history professor at Texas A&M University. Welcome, Alon.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So Alon, thanks for joining us, and was going to ask you if you could explain a little bit of some of the research that you do, and especially in religious extremism.
Yeah. So for pretty much my entire academic career, I've been studying specifically the Christian identity movement, sort of how and why it began, who were the key figures involved, how did they come to be about, and where and when did they start to gain a following, how do they continue to influence both, the fringe movements among white supremacy groups, and then further how their rhetoric is influenced by the mainstream. My research also then broadened out to being more specifically about, or more broadly, about white supremacy groups, because once you start talking about theological justification for white supremacy, you come to realize that while Christian identity might be one prominent method used for, what's commonly referred to as neo-Nazism, that there are so many different subsects of white supremacy, and Christianity, or more specifically Protestantism, is a key facet of many of them. So it sort of I sort of try to look at how and why these interplay, what sort of messages that they continue to put out, and where these messages originated, and why there's still something that is talked about, albeit arguably not as much as it should be today.
And why is it, do you think, that it's specifically the Protestant brand of Christianity rather than, and it may sound like an ignorant question, but I think it's one that the listeners might be interested in. Why not Catholicism, or why is the Protestantism greater?
Well, if we're talking about, my specialty deals with America, right? I deal with American history. And as far as America goes, Protestantism is the dominant denomination of Christianity. In fact, if we go throughout our history as early back as the antebellum period in the early 19th century, there were movements called what was called the nativist movement, and the nativist movement was predominantly anti-Catholic, right? Mm-hmm. So a movement, or even if we look at the second clan, the predominant enemy of the second clan were Catholics. They didn't like the others also, but Hiram Evans, the Grand Wizard or Imperial Dragon or whatever, was quoted saying something along the lines of like, the Roman Catholic Church can never exist in a free America. Their two are just incompatible. So simply because Catholicism was deemed incompatible with what the people who call themselves the true representation of America, the 100% American, the true American, then it's impossible for them to be Catholic, because in their eyes, to be a true American, it was necessary to be a Protestant. Protestantism equates Americanism in a sense. Both are supposed to be about freedom, right? Protestantism is supposed to be about the freedom of how you worship, right? Whereas Americanism is supposed to be the freedom of how you live. So Protestantism equals freedom, Americanism equals freedom, right? Then Protestantism equals Americanism. That's why if we're talking about, right-wing extremist groups in America, white supremacy extremist groups in America, if they are Christian, they are going to be Protestant. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't racism or anti-other racism in other religions. It absolutely is, right? Like racism is omnidirectional, right? Racism moves in every which way. It can be, white anti-black, black anti-Asian. It could be, Latino within the Latino community. It could be Jewish anti-Muslim. It could, it goes in every directions. But if we're talking about predominantly, if we're talking about America and we're talking about religious-based white anti-other racism, if there is a denomination of Christianity involved, most of the time, I would say, I won't go so far as to say 100% because I don't really believe in absolutes, but I would say as close to absolute as possible, they were Protestant.
One thing that I'd
a historian a question.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, that's the danger of asking a historian a question because you're never going to get a short answer.
I was going to say one of the things that I had heard in the movement over the years, especially from the Klan people, is one of the reasons they didn't care for Catholicism was because you had to swear an allegiance or the Pope was a foreign power. So that's how they viewed that. So it was anti-American, and that's
absolutely
in their viewpoint. It was that.
There's all sorts of propaganda they put out, especially during the Second Klan, that the Pope is not simply the head of a church. I mean, look, Vatican City is in fact a country. It is a separate country. If you're in Rome and you walk 10 feet into the Vatican, if you go to an ATM in Rome, you get euros. You go to an ATM in the Vatican, you get Pope money, right? It's a different country, right? Wow. So the head of the Catholic Church, the Pope, you're right. It's not simply the head of a church. He's the head of a state. And the belief was, and unfortunately still is to this day, that if you were a Catholic or if you are a Catholic, that means that if given the opportunity, if the president says something or the Pope says something, the belief is that a Catholic is going to side with the Pope and therefore can never be trusted as an American. It's the same thing that happens, once Israel is created in 1948, right? Jews can no longer be trusted, right? I mean, there's other reasons previously why Jews were never to be trusted, but Jews were never to be trusted because a Jew was never truly an American, right? A Jew was never truly an American. So when Israel becomes a thing in 1948, anytime a Jew was considered, they're like, oh, well, you're picking Israel over America. When there's a lot of Jews, myself included, who had never even been to Israel. But the perception is that there is this incredible tie, this historic tie to Israel in the same way that it was believed that, or it still is believed, that there is this historic tie to the Vatican and the Pope, in which case Catholics or Jews could never be seen as loyal Americans.
Wow. It's pretty interesting. Like, I would have never thought of any of that before. Like, but the way you laid it out, it's very interesting. I can see how.
I mean, it's a dominant perception that the other, whatever that other be, is disloyal to America. If you can show even the smallest amount of semi-tangible proof that other, be it Jews, Catholics, Black people, Chinese people, Japanese people, Latino, gay, whatever, straight, whatever, if you can show any indication that they are potentially disloyal or have some tie to disloyalty, that's all that's needed. That's all that's needed. Because if you can tie it back to that nugget of truth, extremist movements that thrive are the ones that are founded in a little bit of nugget of truth. There's something you can point back to and say, this actually happened. Yep. And if it did, or it can be perceived as something that happened, then all you got to do is build, and then that's easy, right? Like Christian identity, for example, if you accept the premise that Jews are literally the children of Satan, which may sound like a fantastic, like crazy premise. But if you accept that one premise, right, then everything that they say can be made to make true. Everything that they say can be made to make sense, right? I mean, that's the scary thing, right? I've combed through thousands and thousands of pages of Wesley Swift's sermons, you know, the chief progenitor of Christian identity. And every time he quotes scripture, he's pretty much on point. I would be reading it and I'd be like, there's no way, there's no way. And then I would find it and it's there. Is his interpretation the common, the broadly accepted interpretation? No. But the words are still there, you know? And the reason why theological movements, I would argue, are in some ways harder to combat is because you can't prove or disprove faith, right? If somebody says they believe the world was created in 7 days and their source is the Bible, you can throw Darwin after Neil deGrasse Tyson or whoever at them, and their response is, I believe it. And there's, for better or for worse, I mean, I'm not saying it's a bad thing and I'm not saying it's a good thing at all, but you can't disprove faith. It's impossible. That's what makes it faith, right? That's the entire premise of faith, which is wonderful, but obviously can be manipulated.
Right.
You know?
It can serve as like a gateway drug in a lot of ways, where you get somebody, and I think it's a really interesting point that you made as well, is because when you get somebody in the door with something, and that's, as a former propagandist and coming from our background, I mean, that was one of the things. It's like, if we could get somebody on one thing, whether it was illegal immigration, whether it was religion, whatever that grievance was, one grievance, if you could get them in the door with one grievance, then we felt like that we could propagandize them and radicalize. You know, we didn't call it that, but that's what it was radicalized.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's amazing how little is actually necessary, you know? And I'm not saying that like everybody, everybody's going to be radicalized, everyone's going to be turned into extremists, but you know, there are several, you know, like one of the examples I remember from a presentation I was giving was, Jeff, I'm sure you've heard of Keystone State Skinheads, right? Yep. They changed their name to Keystone United a couple years back. And I remember watching a presentation at this conference I was presenting at, where they changed their name to Keystone United. We're talking all about anti-immigration and got hundreds of people to show up at their rally. I want to say it was at Pittsburgh. And regular people are shouting about immigration, having no idea that they're attending a rally of the Keystone State Skinheads, you know? And there's so many things that are so volatile, especially in today's world. But it's nothing new. You know, these types of, I guess trigger points, let's call them, have been existent, you know, as far back as, you know, at least as far as my research can tell, which really gets cracking in the early 20th century. You know, I mean, we're talking about the Second Klan. The trigger points were race. The trigger points was immigration. The trigger point was safety, you know, integration, women's rights, you know, protection of the home and family, which the Klan is still about to this day. You know, who wouldn't want to keep American families safe? In fact, I did this exercise with one of my classes. I showed them a few things about the creed of, I took it from the creed of the Klanswoman. And I didn't tell them what it was, you know, and they all agreed with everything that it said, right? They all agreed with it, you know? Why America should protect its borders. America should be looking out for the family. It changes its meaning entirely when you realize it's the Klan putting it out. You know what they're talking about then, about who they're protecting it from, right, what the family really is. But you know as well as I do that coded language, it's nothing new, right? And the guys who run these movements are really good at it. They're really good at it.
It's tactical, absolutely. My co-host was a preacher's daughter, and I'm sure you've got some questions on religion, perhaps for Alon. And even share a quick story with you. One of the first times when we were both still involved in the National Socialist movement, we had went to, sometimes I would speak at Klan functions and things like that back when I was involved. And she had went along to one of those, Acacia had went along to one of those and said, "This sounds like church." And you know, I shouldn't tell the story, but go ahead, Acacia, and if you have some questions for Alon on religion or anything else, I know we cut you off.
No, it was very interesting to me because I didn't really know what to expect going. It was almost like a racist church service. I was like very confused because growing up, I grew up very close to Baptist, but not a shred of racism growing up. You know, we're all God's children, we're all created equal. And here I'm going to this, and I'm like, wait a minute, like, this is the same Bible that I grew up reading, but this is not the way I grew up reading it at all.
Right.
So it was very interesting in one way. But it was eye-opening to see just how people can twist things to one way or another.
And that is like, again, it's like the beauty and the folly of theology or religion, right? It's interpretive, right? I mean, like, an example I give is one of my students is like, look, thou shalt not kill, right? That's literally etched in stone, right? Well, there have been people who have been thou shalt killing in the name of God for millennia, right? So if that thing is literally written in stone, then even stuff that wasn't written in stone is just as interpretive, right? You can't, like, again, you can't tell somebody that their reading of this passage in scripture of love, like love thy neighbor, right? Love thy neighbor could be interpreted to mean love everyone. Love thy neighbor like you love thyself, right? Could be mean to love everyone. Unless you have a very finite definition of who your neighbor is. If your neighbor only happens to be white people who are of the same denomination as you, then love thy neighbor takes on a drastically different meaning, doesn't it?
Exactly.
Right? Doesn't say anything about anybody else. Doesn't say anything about anyone who's different from you, right? And the difficulty is how do you tell somebody who interprets love thy neighbor as to be just people exactly like me, that what they believe is wrong? Because the only thing you can do is tell them, you're interpreting scripture wrong. Here's my interpretation. You should listen to me. How well is that going to go over?
It doesn't.
Right? It's not. I mean, that, and then it becomes a difficult thing, and it ends up having to be, both people involved have to be very open-minded. And in situations like that, I don't imagine it's true. You know, I mean, again, I don't know what it's like to disassociate from a movement, but I imagine it has to be one hell of a shock to the system. So I imagine it's not something that you just like, you read a passage or someone tells you you're interpreting scripture wrong and you're like, oh, and then, you know, I can't imagine it's that simple, right? So, you know, like that, again, and I'm not trying to dump all over, I'm not trying to dump on religion at all, because I do believe that, you know, it provides us, you know, with hope, with morality, with, you know, all of these amazing positive things. You know, the whole idea of faith is something that is so, you know, I don't know, glorious. You know, it's like to have that faith in something is amazing. But there's also that other side to it. There's also that sort of darker side to it where if someone chooses to, it can be used to justify, and it has been used to justify some of the worst atrocities in human history. And those things are not then seen as atrocities, they're seen as righteous. They're seen as positive goods.
Right.
And that's a problem. That's partly, that's what I study. That's what I study. I study the groups of people, particularly in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, who basically pioneered this stuff, who basically made this into a lasting movement that is still around today. You know, I mean, I know, Jeff, you and I talked about identity ministers, identity church members. I mean, I was in my master's degree. I sent emails to all sorts of identity churches all over the place to get them to send me stuff. They're still here. I mean, are they as big a movement? Were they ever a giant movement? I don't think so. But it's disturbing when you start hearing things, in the mainstream of religion that echo, what identity people would be, okay, we're on board that,
Right.
One of the things that I remember reading years and years ago, I believe it was an FBI report, but I'm not 100% on that, but I'm about 99% on it, that they had said that the most dangerous out of all of the, at least the far right extremists, was the Christian identity people. And people went, well, why is that? They said, well, how can, when you're fighting someone who believes that they have God on their side, that's a dangerous person. And this goes the same for Islamic extremism or any kind of religious extremism. When you have that belief. So that makes sense.
If God is the source of your beliefs, it's hard. I can't imagine. I mean, I've been lucky enough to also hear former identity people give presentations, and it doesn't sound like it was easy to disassociate from that, because your entire worldview, your entire belief is gone. But you can see the allure of it, right? It's like the same allure, the allure of any religion. Religion provides why, right?
Yep.
As human beings, we're always interested in why. Why did this happen? How did this happen? That's what we're interested in. Religion gives you that carte blanche answer, right? It was God's will. And if you have faith, that's enough. That's enough,
Right.
So, I mean, I think I would agree with the fact that, I don't know if they're the most dangerous in terms of violent, but in terms of most difficult to probably dispel of or get rid of, I mean, yeah, I would probably have to agree that it's probably, devout identity believers would probably be among the hardest to, convince that they're on the wrong path. I imagine that would be pretty difficult, because what evidence could you show them? What interaction could you show them? If they have God in their back pocket, what could you show them?
That's a good
and that's
question.
Basically what Wesley Swift, is all about. There's nothing that happens between, I mean, this is the dude who is like, I mean, he's sort of lost to history. I mean, when we think of, you think of, identity, a lot of people go to Butler, Richard Grant Butler and the Aryan Nations. But a lot of people don't also know that Richard Grant Butler, I think he quit his job at Raytheon to serve under Swift. Like, he was Swift's, like, he's viewed himself in competition with William Potter Gale as Swift's, William Potter Gale? Yeah. Am I confusing with the American Nazi Party? Wait. William Potter Gale? No, I'm right. William Potter Gale. Yeah. Sorry. He saw himself in competition with William Carter Gale over the succession for Wesley Swift's church, right? He wins. He moves the whole thing to Idaho, right? And, up until, 1999, it was in existence. And then there are still churches that call themselves the Jesus Christ Christian Aryan Nations Church. The Church of Jesus Christ Christian was Wesley Swift's church. Jesus Christ Christian sounds innocuous, sounds like it's like, okay, Jesus Christ Christian. But what it really means is Jesus Christ was Christian. What Christian identity does, it removes all of Judaism, all of it, from Christian history, with the exception of its satanic origins and the Garden of Eden, that dual seed line theory, right?
There was something, an instance of an individual we know, actually, and since he's public, I think we can say his name, but his name was Kerry Noble, and he was involved with Christian identity, and a very good man, a good friend. And you know, we were talking, you were mentioning a little bit about how hard it is to get people, you know, deprogrammed and out of Christian identity. And Kerry's story, and actually he was on this podcast, for any of the listeners that are hearing it would like to hear more on Kerry Noble's story, you know, tune into that. But what Kerry had done was walked into a gay church, a church that was marrying gay people back in the 80s, with a suitcase loaded with explosives, and was supposed to leave the suitcase, or was going to leave the suitcase there in that church. And it would have probably been, and this was before the Oklahoma City attack. He was involved with the Covenant Sword Arm of the Lord, CSA, and there's another name for it, but the guy that ran it was James Ellison, which I'm sure you've come across in your research. He was calling himself King James, I think, even for a little while. That individual. So they were affiliated with that. And Kerry walked into this church and was going to place that. And when he was sitting in there watching them worship and watching, you know, the service go on, it took him out of that mindset. He says, you know what, even though I don't agree with their lifestyle choice, these people worship God the same way my church worships God. I can't do this. This is wrong. And he walked out with the suitcase and didn't follow through on that. So I mean, that could have potentially been just a horrific. Somebody I should probably put you in touch with for your research as well.
Oh, that'd be great. Yeah. No, I'd love to speak with them. I mean, it's an amazingly, I would say, like, Herculean task to look. A crisis of faith is difficult for anybody, but if you built your whole way of life around this essential racist religion, right? If you built your entire way of life around it, and then something happens that shocks you to your core, I mean, it's got to be something significant. I mean, Kerry would have gone to jail the rest of his life, you know, and he would have murdered probably, I don't know, at least tens of people. Yep. That's not something I would imagine someone takes lightly, but, and he wouldn't have been the first. I mean, there were identity ministers who, you know, after hearing Swift talk, you know, one tried to go to Ole Miss on the day that James Meredith was being integrated. One black man was being integrated into a school, and he was found with a huge amount of TNT in his trunk. Luckily, the FBI caught him before he could do the damage, right? Swift himself I know he was interviewed by the FBI 2 or 3 times, but they never were able to connect him to something, because therein again lies the danger of this church, because we have freedom of religion in this country. And Swift, if you read his sermons, like I've done, he never actually says, go out and kill Jews, go out and kill blacks, go out and, you know, kill immigrants, go out and kill whatever. He doesn't actually say that. What he does do is convince people that these individuals, particularly Jews, are detrimental, to American success. And that if you do this, or if you prevent Jews from existing in America, you're doing God's work. And if that's the case, then these people, right, don't believe they're committing murder. They're not committing murder from their perspective. And that is hellishly dangerous. You know, I think there's some saying that there's nothing more dangerous than someone who believes in what they're doing. There's something like that. I'm totally messing up the quote, but there's something like that, you know? And if they fully embrace this idea that Jews are literally Satan's soldiers on earth, what Jewish people do are the will of Satan. That everything that Henry Ford wrote about the Jews and the International Jew, from everything that Hitler ripped him off for, to anything that, you know, with the silver shirts, anything with, you know, the White Citizens Council, any incarnation of the Klan, you know, the Christian identity movement that really gets going in the 50s, you know, to the American Nazi Party with George Lincoln Rockwell, that was the name I was forgetting earlier, with Rockwell's movement, which really takes off mostly after he dies, you know. But all of this stuff, you know, is centered on these premises that you are doing your duty as an American. You are doing your duty as an American. And that's dangerous. That's dangerous, you know?
It's very dangerous. Now, how did you, and you might have mentioned this before or whatever, but obviously being a historian and theology and all of that, like, what made you decide to look up theology and Christian identity movement and neo-Nazism?
It was a show I was working on. As before I became a historian, I spent about 5.5 years working in television production. And I was working on a show that had to do with prison gangs. And one of the prison gangs we were dealing with, or genre of prison gangs we were dealing with, was white supremacy prison gangs. And I got so fascinated in how, from talking to the FBI, to law enforcement, to, you know, anybody who tracked and monitored these guys, I got so fascinated that I'd find myself spending hours after work just talking to them. Because I just wanted to know more about how they went after it. And then this is when I was living in New York, or New Jersey actually, but I was working in Manhattan. And a prison guard in Connecticut said to me, you know what, go back to school, get a master's degree in a research intensive discipline and figure out why this crap still exists. And that's what happened. Less than 2 months later, I was enrolled at Seton Hall University with the express purpose of studying this stuff to eventually work for the FBI. And then while I was at Seton Hall, I had an amazing mentor and guide named Professor Jim McCartan. And I got so fascinated with the study of how this is studied that I ended up going on to American University for my doctorate, still with the intent to work for the FBI. And then, you know, I got trained and I got cleared by the Air Force, was hired as a consultant. But while I was waiting for, you know, anyone who has ever applied for a government job knows it takes a long time. And then all throughout this time, I've been studying it and learning more about it. And I ended up achieving my doctorate in 2019. And literally, I guess because I have a doctorate now, I can claim to be an expert in studying this stuff. Imposter syndrome is real, right? But yeah, no, I've been essentially knee deep in studying this stuff since 2009. I mean, I have sermon after sermon of probably almost everything Wesley Swift has ever written or said. I've got, you know, books that probably aren't very good titles I could show you. You know, I mean, I've just been so fascinated by how and why this stuff still continues to, you know, plague the country. And I've started actually, you know, and this is something that I've been working with Jeff on, is starting to work on how we come to characterize white supremacy. And I think we do it too broad stroked, right? Because as I know you've told me, Jeff, you know, someone who, you know, was in the National Socialist movement isn't the same as someone who is a Christian identist, who is surely not the same as someone who is in the Klan, right? Who's surely not somebody who's in like some, you know, American Freedom Defense Initiative kind of thing. They're not the same. We lump them all together as white supremacy movements. And I think that's sort of problematic, because if we're truly trying to understand how and why these things exist, and with the ultimate goal of, you know, eventually, or trying to combat or rehabilitate, we need to know that there's a significant difference, and then lumping them all together as white supremacists does us, as the people who study it, actually a disservice, because we sort of just blur the lines, and that's not the same. You know, as someone who works to rehabilitate someone, you're not going to approach someone who's, you know, been in the Klan for 30 years the same way you're going to approach someone who's in the National Socialist movement, you know? So what I've been working to do is sort of divest white supremacy into subheadings that I think are more appropriate, you know? And I think one of the major ones that I deal with is what I would now call, I know I said I study neo-Nazism, but because that's what it's called, that's what everyone knows it as. But I think I would recharacterize it. I mean, again, I'm only talking about America here because that's my specialty. I would characterize it as Americanized Nazism, right? Because there's nothing really neo about the movement. There's nothing really new. It really is just whether it's the religious side, the theological side, or the ideological side, these movements are uniquely American, you know? Like again, Jeffrey and I discussed that people in the National Socialist movement, the Nazis of the 1930s and the 1940s are not the National Socialists in America. Christian identists are not the German Christian movement or the Deutsche Christian of the 1930s. They're not. This is American Nazism, right? So, and then
it doesn't all fit into that. It doesn't all fit into one small box, does it?
And I think it's necessary to understand it for what it is, to truly try to analyze it, you know, and then whether it's to, you know, on my end to explain and explore how and why, or like on your end to help people disassociate, you got to know what you're dealing with. And if we simply lump them all together, we're not going to do that, you know? So I divested into this Americanized Nazism, white nationalism, which I would probably associate with like your Klansmen. And I actually came up with, I think, a third term that I know I was struggling with. I think I came up with what was it calling? I was calling it white blindness. These are the I'm not racist but people. These are the people who I think white blindness, because it's willful blindness. It's willful blindness, but we're talking again about white supremacy. So we're talking about white anti-other, right? So those people who say like, I'm not racist, but you got to admit there's more black people in jail than white people, or I'm not racist, but it's only, you know, Mexican people. Remember, most people think Mexico goes from the southern tip of the United States all the way down to Chile and includes Portugal and Spain. It's only Mexican people who are crossing the border. You know, I'm not racist, but, you know, it's only those are the only illegals. You know, I'm not racist, but, you know, all gay people want to just molest children. I'm not racist. Look, if you say the sentence, I'm not racist, but just stop there, because whatever's about to follow is going to be racist. And that comes from this sort of, I would argue the reason why I think characterizing it as white blindness might actually work is because it's this willful sort of ignorance, this willful blindness. Like, I don't want to know about this. I have my opinion. I have not even my opinion. I have my facts already laid out. These people do X, Y, and Z. That's it. So it's like a willful ignorance, a willful blindness. And once you divest it into those three groups, I think you can start really looking at, okay, so I have this guy who happens to be, you know, he's not a member of any movement. He has these tendencies to, you know, ascribe to different, you know, posts and whatever that, you know, denigrate whatever the other is. But he's not a member of any of these organizations. So he might not need to disassociate. He may just need to be re-educated. That's a different thing. Disassociating and education are different things. Curing ignorance is something I'm tasked with as a professor, right? That's not the same thing as what you're doing. So the way you would approach one is not the way you would approach the other. And I know that was a lot, and I probably don't even, you think you just asked me how I studied, how I got into this stuff. And
no, I was going to ask you about you just beat me to the question, because it was important. I think that people do hear about that, and you're right. There's so many different ways of looking at this stuff, and if you just lump it all into a box or label it, you're not getting at it from the right place. But ideally, you know, in a future America, in our hopefully in our lifetimes, prevent is where it's at. If we can prevent our young people, in the schools is where it starts. You know, if we can prevent them from falling into these extreme movements, that's really where it's at.
And that's where education is so important, you know. And we have these, you know, these boogeymen that they're putting out here, you know, like, I mean, I'm in Texas, and, you know, they're banning this whole stuff about critical race theory. And I gotta tell you, most high school teachers have no idea what critical race theory is. And if they do, they're not teaching it, right? Critical race theory is something you only ever hear about in grad studies. And it's really just saying, you know, America has had a problem with racism, so we have to deal with it. That's essentially the core of what it's at. So we boogeyman these things, and they make them like there's such a big thing. And the reason why we boogeyman them, and I'm turning that into a verb for some reason, is for certain politicians to score political points. That's it, you know, and that's problematic. That's problematic. As long as people are willing to manipulate the other whatever the other may be, just to score political points, this is going to be a problem. This is going to be a problem. And, you know, look, I'll back our colleges. You know, I think our colleges or universities are among the best in the world. But like, I think of last like study, like our high schools are like lagging behind the rest of the world by like a drastic amount, and it shouldn't be, you know? And I think a lot of that comes from, and this is another just pet peeve also, because, you know, my wife was a high school history teacher who actually lost her job to a football coach. And when she told me that, I actually laughed because I didn't think that was real, you know, but the South, you know, I mean, I'm not too horribly against it because it was because of that she moved to DC, and that's where I met her. So I'm cool because now, you know, I'm cool with it. But, you know, I talk to my students and like most of them have never learned. And I'm not trying to say that, oh, because I'm a historian, my discipline's the most important. I mean, I think we're lagging behind in social science education, period. You know, and I think the reason for that is because there's just no emphasis on it. How can learning history make me money? Speaking as a historian, it can't. But it's worth knowing. Because if, you know, everyone's like, why do we study history? Oh, those who forget the past are condemned to repeat it. Well, then we actually have to study it because we do keep repeating it over and over again. And if I'm borrowing a tagline from, you know, a film production I'm helping called A Nazi on Wall Street, you know, every time history repeats itself, the price goes up. And that's true. Every time it repeats itself, the price goes up. I don't think that's the most succinct way to put it.
The human cost.
Yeah.
You're talking
any cost. It could cost a human cost. It costs us as a society. It just costs us as a country more. You know, it puts us as a country. I mean, us, the entire us, not just a certain demographic of us, the entire us. You know, it puts us all back.
Is there, Alon, is there any other projects or subjects that you want to cover this evening, or that you want to tell us about or share with the listening audience?
You know, my philosophy is, you know, I mean, if anyone in the audience is interested in hearing more about the stuff I study, you know, I'm a big believer in the role of a professor being to answer questions, to educate, right? So if I can be of any service, if anyone has a question, I have no problem sharing, you know, one of my 10,000 emails, you know, for someone to send me an email to ask questions. Because I do believe that, you know, education is an incredibly important part of this. And while I can't teach people to be open-minded, I can't force open-mindedness at people. What I can do is show you a different perspective. What I can do is show you a different way to approach what you may already think. And then it's, if you want to continue the discussion, and it should be a discussion, and it will be a discussion on my end, at least, then I'm open to it. I'm open to it. And whatever else I can address for you guys, if there's any other questions you guys have.
Have you received any backlash from choosing to study what you study? Like, have you received any backlash, say, from family or friends or anybody that just thinks like, why in the world would you want to study something like that? Like,
I mean, I got questions of like, huh? Like, what are you doing? But usually, like, my family has generally been pretty supportive of what I do. And the only backlash I tend to get is from, I've gotten backlash from some students, you know, who think that, you know, because I'm Jewish, that this is the only reason I'm that, and I'm like some kind of secret Jewish supremacist. I've had students, you know, write me research papers on why Hitler was right, as a sort of, you know, FU. But that's not something I take seriously, because that's nothing about me. That's about them. As far as backlash, I don't think I can say I've ever really encountered any real backlash. Questions, sure. Critiques, absolutely. And I welcome those. I don't think any academic worth his salt shouldn't expect to be critiqued or questioned, because that's the very core of what we do, right? This whole thing that I just laid out about studying white supremacy is me critiquing and questioning previous scholars who have way more experience than I do, how they have characterized white supremacy, right? I'm the new kid on the block. I've only had my doctorate for like 2 years, and like, I'm just I'm the new guy. But that doesn't mean that I think my ideas are any less valid. But I mean, I don't know. I'm going to present this paper idea at the end of the month, at the end of October, and I could be flayed alive. You know, but that would be good, because then I would know what needs to be done to make the paper better and more comprehensive. Right. You know, criticism isn't an end game; it's a chance to get better. Ooh, that should be a tagline.
That's a good one.
That's a great
tagline for something. Yes. That should be a tagline, man. That's how you know I used to work in television.
It was good. It was good.
That should be a tagline. Let's get that trending. You're welcome. Historians, we know things, man. Don't question us. I mean, question us. Totally question us all the time. Question us. So yeah,
it's awesome.
If there's anything else I can answer for you guys, or for your audience, or you know, if I can be a resource to Beyond Barriers, you know, just as you know, an expert. You know, I have to get used to just saying an expert. I can't do it yet. An expert. In the sort of hows and whys, the academic side of what these movements are about and why they continue to exist and attract people, then by all means, please contact me.
And I think that's incredibly important too. One thing we've discussed before too is sometimes you have people that have had the lived experience, you know, like us in the former sector, and then you have people in the academic sector that have studied this stuff too. And I think we both have got to be working hand in hand. To all of us in society have got to come together and not pretend like just one side has all the answers, because none of us have all the answers.
No.
But
and
together
I think
we can accomplish so much. You know?
I think that's, I 100% agree. You know, I don't know what it's like to have been in the movement. I don't know what it was like to live this, but I can contextualize some of the things that you may have, or you or other formers may have lived and accepted. I could maybe provide a context for why that was something that was talked about, you know? Right. Or why that was something that was popular in America, or why that track of like why maybe in the 80s talking about immigration would have worked really well, you know, or why in the 90s it became more emphasis on family, or, you know, or in the 70s why it was why there was a lot of a larger anti-Latino sentiment than anything else, you know, that's the stuff I can provide, you know, a context for. You know, or at least try to. And if not, if I can't provide it, you know, I have the resources and the ability to find out the answer to the question, or the context who I could find out the answer, or an answer, right? I would never go so far as to say I have the answer, but I could provide an answer for the question, or a question that you may have, or that anyone may have.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us at Beyond Barriers this evening, and for all your help and the work that you're doing out there, Alon. We can edit. I'm terrible at the opening and closing parts.
I personally think you should leave that. You should leave it. You should leave it and start with "Don't call me Alan" and then finish it with
"Yeah, right,
right, exactly."